Hello, young soul. Welcome to the Daily Horror Channel. If you are afraid of real and scary reports, this channel is not for you. I suggest you leave this video, but if you are not afraid of listening to these horrifying reports, I suggest you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. On the outskirts of a small town called Grayville, Anna, a young university student, works as an app driver to pay for her studies. The empty, dark streets of the city at night were always a peaceful setting for her, until a rainy and seemingly ordinary night turned into a nightmare. What began as a simple race became a terrifying fight for survival, leaving an indelible mark on his life. I'm Anna, an app driver trying to save money for college. I've always liked the night, the silence and the calm it brings, but I never imagined that this same tranquility could hide something so sinister. That rainy night, I got in my car and got ready for another shift, not knowing that my next passenger would change my life forever. It was an especially cold and rainy night, and the streets of Grayville were deserted. The sound of rain hitting the windshield created an almost hypnotic melody, but the solitude of the night always calmed me. After a few peaceful runs, I received a request to pick up a passenger in an area further away from the city. I accepted the call without thinking twice, adjusted the GPS, and headed towards the location. When I arrived, I saw a man standing in the dim light of a streetlight. He wore a heavy coat and a hat that covered his face. Something about him made me uncomfortable from the start, but I couldn't turn down the race. He got into the car silently and, without taking off his hat, told me the destination address in a low, hoarse voice. "Hilltop Farm, please," he said. The farm was far from the city, in an isolated area that I barely knew. I had heard stories about that region, but I always thought they were just urban legends. Despite the discomfort, I smiled and said, "Sure, let's go." The path was winding and the rain only increased, making visibility difficult. The silence inside the car was oppressive, and I felt a chill run down my spine every time I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the passenger's shadowy eyes reflected back. I tried to start a conversation to ease the tension. "It's raining a lot, right? It doesn't look like it's going to stop anytime soon," I commented, hoping for a friendly response. He just mumbled something unintelligible and went back to looking out the window, ignoring my attempt at conversation. The silence returned, heavier than before. With each kilometer covered, the feeling of oppression increased, and I began to realize that something was terribly wrong. While driving, I heard a strange sound coming from the back seat. It was as if something was scratching the upholstery. I looked in the rearview mirror, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. My heart started to beat faster, and I tried to focus on the road. "Is everything okay there?" I asked, trying to remain calm. He didn't respond, just continued looking outside, his heavy breathing creating a fog in the window. The scratching sound continued, and I started to break out in a cold sweat, despite the air conditioning being on. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. I decided to turn up the volume on the radio to break the silence, but static filled the stations, interspersed with whispers that I couldn't understand. I hung up quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. With every minute, the tension increased, and I felt like I needed to get out of that situation as quickly as possible. We arrived at a dirt road that led to the farm. The city lights had disappeared, and we were surrounded by total darkness. The rain turned the road into a quagmire, and the car began to spin. It was then that the passenger finally said something that chilled me to the bone. "You shouldn't have come here," he said in a voice that seemed to come from a deep, dark place. The car slid and stopped. The engine died, and I tried to start it again without success. The man in the back seat began to breathe more heavily, and I felt an oppressive presence approaching. Suddenly, I felt a cold touch on my shoulder. I quickly turned around, but there was no one there. The passenger was motionless, his eyes fixed on me. "Who's there?" I screamed, panic taking over. The man began to laugh, a low, sinister laugh that echoed in the car. "They're here for you," he whispered. Before I could react, I felt an invisible force pulling me out of the car. I was thrown into the mud, the rain falling heavily on me. I stood up with difficulty and saw shadows moving around the car, indistinct shapes that seemed to be alive. The passenger's figure exited the car and began to transform into something inhuman, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. I ran as fast as I could, tripping and falling in the mud. The shadows followed me, whispering my name. I felt a biting cold pass through my body, and every breath was a struggle. I found an old abandoned cabin and hid inside, trying to control my heavy breathing. The cabin was dark and smelled musty. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, creating a frightening sound. I stood there, shaking with fear, listening to the footsteps of whatever was chasing me. With each step, the floor creaked and I felt myself getting closer. Suddenly, the cabin door slowly opened. A tall, slender figure, covered in shadows, entered. Her eyes glowed in the darkness, and she began to slowly approach. I felt my strength draining away and hopelessness took over. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. "You have attracted their attention," the figure replied. "And now, they won't stop until they get what they want." I remembered an old violin that was in a corner of the cabin. Covered in dust, I picked up the instrument and, without knowing exactly what I was doing, I started playing a sad and desperate melody. The figure stopped, looking confused, and the surrounding shadows retreated a little. I continued playing, feeling a strange energy fill the room. The figure began to dissolve, screaming in agony. The shadows disappeared, and silence took over. I dropped the violin, exhausted, and fell to my knees on the cabin floor. When I looked outside, the rain had stopped, and the first ray of sunlight was beginning to illuminate the horizon. I scrambled to my feet and began walking back to the car, feeling as if I had survived a nightmare. When he got to the car, the passenger had disappeared and the engine started again as if nothing had happened. I drove back to the city, still in shock from what I had experienced. When I got home, I locked all the doors and windows, finally feeling safe. However, I couldn't forget the passenger's words and the feeling that something was still watching me. I spent weeks trying to understand what had happened. Life returned to normal, but the fear never left me. I decided to research Hilltop Farm and discovered that decades ago, it was the site of a sanatorium where patients were subjected to horrific experiments. Many of them died terrible deaths and their souls were trapped there seeking revenge. Now I'm more cautious, but I know the terror of Cold Ridge Sanitarium is not over. I feel like one day I'll have to face those shadows again. And when that happens, I will be ready to fight for my life once again. Meanwhile, I continue my routine as an app driver, but with a constant fear that the next race could be the last. Darkness still surrounds me, and whispers continue to torment me on lonely nights. What happened that night scarred me, and I know that true terror is still lurking, waiting to strike when I least expect it. Weeks have passed since that fateful night, but the feeling of overwhelm and fear has never left me. I began to notice changes in my routine. Objects moved on their own in my house, shadows danced on the walls at night, and indistinct whispers filled my ears when I was alone. I felt like the evil presence I encountered at Hilltop Farm had followed me home. I decided not to tell anyone about what was happening. Who would believe me? I just continued my routine, trying to ignore the disturbing events around me. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more intense the events became. One night when I returned from work, I found my front door ajar. My heart raced and I knew something was very wrong. I entered cautiously, holding a screwdriver as a makeshift weapon. The lights flickered and a biting cold passed through my house. The whispers were louder and clearer now, and I could make out words like "come" and "alone." I walked into the living room, where I saw something that chilled me to the bone. In the middle of the room, there was an indistinct figure shrouded in shadow, with eyes glowing a malevolent red. She slowly turned to me, and I recognized the face of the passenger who took me to Hilltop Farm. "Did you think you could escape?" he whispered, his voice echoing in my head. "We are linked now. You brought us with you." Panic gripped me. but I knew running away was not an option. I decided to face it head on. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. "We want you to feel the same terror you caused us," he replied, approaching slowly. "You freed us, and now we will devour your soul." Suddenly, the figure disappeared, and my house was engulfed in total darkness. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the hallways, and I felt a presence approaching from all sides. I ran to the bedroom, trying to find some kind of refuge. I locked the door and leaned against it, breathing heavily. The walls began to shake and shadows began to form, taking on grotesque, distorted shapes. Human figures with disfigured faces and empty eyes approached me, stretching out skeletal hands. I heard a macabre laugh, and the figure of the passenger appeared again, this time closer. "You cannot escape us," he said, in a voice that seemed to tear reality itself. Desperately, I remembered the violin in the cabin. I ran to the closet where I kept the violin I had brought that night. I took it out and began to play the sad melody that had been playing before. The shadows receded slightly, but the figure of the passenger remained, his eyes fixed on me with indescribable rage. The melody seemed to weaken the shadows, but I knew I needed something more powerful to banish this presence for good. I continued playing, trying to remain calm as I thought of a solution. Then an idea occurred to me. I remembered the ancient rituals I had read about while researching Hilltop Farm. I pulled out the notebook I had made and began to recite an ancient exorcism incantation. My voice shook, but I continued, blending the sound of the violin with the words of the incantation. The figure of the passenger began to scream, his features distorted in pain and hatred. The shadows around him dissolved, and he began to disintegrate, screaming in agony as he disappeared. The chill in the room eased and the light slowly returned. I fell to my knees, exhausted, the violin slipping from my hands. The silence was deafening, but I knew I had achieved a small victory. The shadows had disappeared, but the oppressive feeling was still there. As if something else was lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike, I spent the night awake, afraid that if I closed my eyes, I would be attacked again. However, morning came, and the sunlight brought some relief. I knew that I needed help to understand what was happening and how to rid myself of this evil presence once and for all. I decided to seek out Clara, the psychic medium I had met on an online forum. I told her everything that had happened, from the ride to the events in my home. Clara agreed to help me and came to my house to perform a spiritual cleansing session. Upon entering, Clara immediately sensed the evil presence. "There is a very powerful energy here," she said, lighting candles and scattering herbs on the floor. "It will take all our strength to banish it." Clara began to recite incantations, and the atmosphere in the house grew heavy again. The shadows began to form and the figure of the passenger appeared once more, this time accompanied by other dark entities. Clara was undeterred and continued to chant the incantations with more fervor. The entities screamed, trying to advance on us, but Clara stood firm. I picked up the violin again and began to play the same melody, feeling the energy intensify around us. The entities retreated, but the figure of the passenger seemed stronger than ever. Suddenly, Clara changed tactics and began to chant a different incantation, an ancient banishing ritual. The energy in the room changed, and the shadows began to dissolve, screaming in agony. The figure of the passenger screamed in rage, but slowly began to disappear, being sucked into a vortex of light that Clara had created. When the last shadow disappeared, the room fell silent again. Clara fell to her knees, exhausted but smiling. "We did it," she said, panting. "The entities have been banished." We helped Clara to her feet, and I felt a peace I had not experienced in weeks. The evil presence was gone, and my home was finally free. However, I knew I still needed to be cautious, as the terror I had faced had left deep scars. Clara advised me to continue with the protection rituals and gave me amulets to keep the spirits away. I thanked her deeply, feeling a new hope rise within me. I knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but I was determined to reclaim my life and find peace. Over time, the scars began to heal, and the feeling of oppression eased. I returned to my routine, stronger and more cautious. However, on stormy nights, when the wind howled and shadows danced on the walls, I could still hear distant whispers, reminding me of the terror I had faced. Now, I always carry Clara's violin and amulets with me, ready to face any shadow that may arise. I know that the fight against evil entities never really ends, but I am more prepared than ever. What happened that night left a mark on me, but it also gave me the strength and courage to face the unknown. And so, with a determined heart and a strengthened soul, I continue my journey, knowing that true terror may always lurk, but that I am now ready to face it head-on, without fear. The months passed, and despite the protective measures, the feeling that something was watching me never completely disappeared. I continued to drive to pay for my studies, but each ride was accompanied by constant apprehension. Life took its course, but one night in particular proved that the terror I faced had not been completely defeated. It was a stormy night. The rain was hitting the windshield hard, making visibility difficult. I was finishing my shift when I received a request to pick up a passenger in the same remote area as before. A shiver ran down my spine, but I decided to accept it, determined to face my fears. I arrived at the location, and to my surprise, the same shadowy figure was there, waiting under the dim streetlight. He got into the car, and the air immediately felt heavy. I felt an icy cold pass through my body. "Hilltop Farm, please," he said in the same hoarse voice as before. This time, instead of feeling fear, I felt fierce determination. I started the car and drove in silence, my heart pounding. As we approached the dirt road, the passenger began to mumble something in a strange language, and the radio began to emit static, interspersed with indistinct whispers. "Do you think you can escape us?" he whispered, with a tone of voice that seemed to echo inside my mind. "We are part of you now." The car started to skid in the mud, and the engine died again. The oppressive presence grew, and shadows began to form around us. I picked up the violin I kept on the passenger seat and started playing the sad melody. The shadows receded slightly, but the passenger seemed immune. He got out of the car, transforming back into the inhuman figure, his eyes glowing with an intense red light. "That's not going to work this time," he said, advancing towards me. "You brought something with you, and now let's put an end to it once and for all." Desperate, I continued playing the violin, but I felt I needed something more. I remembered the amulet Clara gave me and held it tightly, reciting the protection incantation she had taught me. The figure screamed in rage, but continued to advance. The shadows around him became more aggressive, trying to grab me. I felt my strength diminish and hopelessness began to take over. It was then that, out of the shadows, a figure of light appeared. It was Clara, her presence radiating powerful energy. "Lucas, we need to finish this together," she said, her voice firm and clear. "Play the violin and recite the incantation with me." I held the violin tighter and began to play while Clara recited the incantation. The light around Clara intensified, and the shadows began to disintegrate, screaming in agony. The inhuman figure retreated, its eyes filled with hatred and pain. Suddenly, the figure moved forward again, faster than before, and I knew we needed something more. Clara took my hand, and together, we recited the final words of the incantation with all the strength we had. Light exploded around us, swallowing figure and shadows in a blinding glare. When the light dissipated, silence reigned. The inhuman figure had disappeared, and the feeling of oppression had dissipated. I looked at Clara, exhausted but relieved. "We did it," she said with a tired smile. We helped each other up, and I started walking back to the car. But before I entered, I heard one last whisper in the wind, faint but unmistakable. "We'll meet again, Lucas." I looked around, but there was nothing but darkness and rain. I got into the car, feeling exhausted but determined. Clara accompanied me back to the city, and we talked about what we had faced. We knew that evil had not been completely defeated, but we had achieved an important victory. Arriving home, I locked all the doors and windows, keeping the protective amulets around me. The feeling of relief was brief, but the determination to keep fighting was stronger. That was the height of my terror, and I knew that the fight against the shadows was far from over. Now, with Clara by my side, I am more prepared than ever to face whatever comes. I know the shadows may return, but I am ready to face them head on. True terror may always lurk, but my courage and determination are even greater. And so, with a strong heart and a strengthened soul, I continue my journey knowing that terror may return, but that I am ready to face it no matter what. On the outskirts of the peaceful town of Villanova, a lonely and abandoned house stood like a monument to forgotten times. Known to locals as the Hunter's House, its reputation was bone-chilling. They said it had belonged to a reclusive, trophy-obsessed hunter who disappeared without a trace. The house, shrouded in mystery and fear, attracted the attention of Lucas, a young journalist in search of a big story. Lucas didn't know that when he walked through the door of that house, his life would change forever. My name is Lucas, and I have always been driven by an insatiable curiosity. When I heard about Casa do Caçador, I knew I needed to see it for myself. I invited my friends, Ana and João, for an adventure that I believed would yield a fascinating article and perhaps an opportunity for us to have a little fun. That sunny afternoon, we drove down the dirt road that led to the house, our hearts beating faster with every kilometer. The house, seen up close, was even more imposing. The dark wooden walls were covered in moss, and the broken windows looked like empty eyes watching us. An old, rusty fence surrounded the grounds, and the gate hung on a single hinge, creaking at the slightest movement of the wind. The silence was absolute, except for the rustling of leaves and the distant song of a lone bird. Ana, always the most practical of the group, suggested that we explore the surroundings before entering. John, however, was eager to find out what was inside. With a defiant smile, he pushed open the front door, which opened with a loud click, revealing a dark, dusty interior. We entered the house carefully, lighting the way with flashlights. The air was cold and heavy, and a musty, rotten smell permeated the room. The walls were adorned with stuffed animal heads, trophies from past hunts which seemed to watch us with dead eyes. There was a feeling of oppression, as if the house was alive, waiting. As we walked through the rooms, I started to notice strange things. Small noises, like light footsteps and whispers, echoed through the hallways. The shadows seemed to move, dancing on the walls like restless ghosts. He felt an increasing cold, which could not be explained solely by the lack of heating. We found the living room, which seemed untouched by time. An antique fireplace dominated the opposite wall, and dust-covered furniture was arranged around it. In the center of the room, a solid wooden table was filled with papers and old photos. Ana picked up one of the photos, showing a tall, thin man with piercing eyes and a sinister smile. "Must be the hunter," she murmured, and something in his voice made me shudder. João, always the most curious, found a door that led to the basement. We went down the stone stairs, which creaked under our feet, and came across a dark, damp room. The air was cold, and each breath formed a small cloud. In the center of the basement, an old wooden chest caught our attention. We opened it carefully, revealing a macabre collection of bones and skins. Suddenly, the basement seemed to grow colder, and an icy wind blew, extinguishing our flashlights. We were in the dark for an eternal moment, until I managed to rekindle mine. Ana and João were pale and shaking. The silence was broken by a scratching sound coming from inside the walls. It felt like something was moving, crawling, trying to get out. We ran up the stairs, locking the basement door behind us. Fear was written all over our faces, but there was a growing determination to discover the truth about that house. We decided to explore the upper floor, where legends said the hunter kept his most precious trophies. The second floor was even darker. The bedroom doors were ajar and the air was thick and oppressive. Each step echoed like a drum, and the whispers seemed to follow us, growing in intensity. I entered what appeared to be the master bedroom, where a large four-poster bed dominated the space. The velvet curtains were torn and dusty, and the mirror in the corner was covered in cobwebs. However, what really caught my attention was a large glass display case in the center of the room. Inside was an ancient violin, beautifully carved but covered in dark stains that looked like dried blood. A feeling of uneasiness came over me, and I realized that that violin must have been of special importance to the hunter. While watching the violin, I heard Anna's scream coming from another room. I ran to see what had happened and found her standing, shaking, looking at a wall full of old portraits. Each portrait showed a different person, but they all had something in common, a look of pure terror. It seemed as if these people had been captured at the moment of their deaths. João, trying to remain calm, suggested that we get together and leave the house. But when we tried to go downstairs, we discovered that the front door was locked. It seemed like the house wouldn't let us leave so easily. Panic began to take over us, and I felt a crushing pressure in my chest. It was then that I heard the sound of the violin, a low, ominous melody that seemed to come from everywhere. The sound reverberated off the walls, filling the house with an evil energy. I looked around, trying to find the source of the sound, but there was no one there. The house seemed to come to life, with the shadows moving more aggressively and the whispers turning into screams. The ground shook beneath our feet, and the walls seemed to close in around us. Anna and João were panicking, and I knew we needed to find a way out quickly. I remembered the windows on the upper floor and suggested that we try to escape there. We ran up the stairs with the sound of the violin chasing us. When we reached the master bedroom again, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. The hunter's figure was standing next to the glass display case, playing the violin with an expression of pure malice. "Who are you?" I shouted, trying to confront the figure, but it just kept playing, its eyes fixed on me. Anna and João tried to open the window, but it was locked from the inside. We felt like time was running out, and the feeling of despair was overwhelming. I decided I needed to face the hunter somehow. I picked up a piece of wood from the floor and moved towards him, but before I could hit him, he disappeared, leaving only the violin lying on the floor. I picked up the violin, feeling a strange energy emanating from it. I remembered something I had read in one of the papers downstairs about a ritual that could free trapped souls. I decided this was our only chance. I lit some candles we found and started reciting the words I had memorized. The house began to shake violently, and the hunter's figure reappeared, screaming in rage. The shadows around us stirred like a storm, but I continued reciting the ritual, feeling the energy grow. The hunter tried to advance but was repelled by the candlelight. With a final scream, the figure dissolved into a cloud of shadows that dissipated into the air. Silence returned to the house, and the oppression seemed to lessen. Anna and João were exhausted, but relieved. We managed to open the window and escaped into the garden, feeling the fresh air for the first time in hours. As we looked at the house, we knew something had changed. The evil that inhabited it seemed to have been banished, but the feeling that we were not completely safe still hung over us. We decided to return to the city and tell our story, hoping that no one else would have to face the terror we experienced. The hunter's house, now empty and silent, still held its secrets. I felt that this story was far from over, and that the true evil could just be dormant, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The battle for peace and sanity was just beginning, and we were ready to face any challenge that came our way, with the courage and determination to never give up on the light, even on the darkest nights. We walked quickly down the hill, our hearts still pounding. Every shadow, every sound in the forest felt like a threat. Upon arriving in the city, Anna, João, and I decided to meet the next morning to discuss what we would do next. No one wanted to admit it, but we knew the hunter's house was still in our thoughts, haunting us. That night I lay down in bed, but sleep didn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the hunter's face, heard the melody of the violin. The weight of the house was still on me, as if something was seeping into my thoughts. I decided I couldn't go on like this. I needed to understand what had really happened in the house and what triggered the events we faced. The next day, I met with Anna and João at a local cafe. We tell what each person felt and saw, trying to put together the pieces of the macabre puzzle. I remembered the papers and photos we found in the living room and suggested we return to the house during the day to gather more information. Reluctant, but determined to put an end to the terror that haunted us, we agreed to return. The house looked even more desolate in the daylight. We entered carefully, feeling the same oppression, although less intense than the previous night. We went straight to the living room and began to rummage through the papers and photos. I found an old journal written by the hunter himself. As we read it, we learned that he had been obsessed with an evil spirit that he believed he could control through rituals and sacrifices. Each entry in the journal revealed more about the hunter's growing madness. He recounted visions of a tall, pale man who appeared in his dreams, demanding more sacrifices. The hunter described how he played the violin to summon the spirit, and how he believed this would bring him power and immortality. But something went terribly wrong, and the spirit ended up trapping his soul in the house, turning him into a shadow of his former self. As we read, the air in the room began to grow heavier. The shadows seemed to lengthen and move of their own accord. We felt a growing chill, and an oppressive presence surrounded us. We knew we were not alone. We decided to split up to cover more ground and find any clues that might help us break the curse. Anna went to the kitchen, John went upstairs, and I stayed in the living room. Suddenly, I heard a scream coming from upstairs. I ran upstairs and found John standing trembling in front of a large mirror at the end of the hallway. Reflected in the mirror, I saw the figure of the hunter, his gaze full of hatred. He raised his hand, and the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, sending fragments flying across the hallway. We ran back to the living room where Anna was waiting, pale and frightened. She had found a map of the house, with a secret room marked in the basement. We decided we needed to investigate. I went downstairs to the basement again, with the feeling that something terrible awaited us. The basement was even colder than before. We found the door marked on the map, hidden behind an old bookcase. With effort, we pushed the bookcase aside to reveal a solid wooden door covered in strange symbols. We opened the door and entered a small room where the air was thick with evil energy. In the center of the room was an altar with ritual objects, spent candles, and more bones. A large mirror stood against the wall, and it seemed to pulse with a dark light. I realized that the mirror was the key to everything. We needed to destroy it to end the hunter's influence. With a hammer we found in the basement, I prepared to destroy the mirror. But before I could do so, I felt an invisible force push me back. The hunter appeared again, emerging from the shadows, his gaze fixed on me. "You will not destroy my legacy," he whispered, his voice a cold, sharp echo. Anna and João tried to help me, but they were thrown against the walls by an invisible force. I knew I had to act quickly. I gathered all my strength and rage and struck the mirror with the hammer. The glass shattered, emitting a high-pitched scream that echoed through the basement. The hunter's figure writhed and screamed, his form beginning to disintegrate. The shadows around us stirred violently, but began to disappear, sucked in by the light emanating from the shards of the broken mirror. The basement shook, and for a moment, I thought the entire house would collapse. With a final cry of despair, the hunter dissolved into a cloud of shadows that dissipated into the air. The basement fell silent, and the feeling of oppression finally disappeared. We knew we had won, but at a high cost. We left the house, exhausted and injured, but relieved. We looked at the structure that now seemed nothing more than an old abandoned building, no longer burdened by the evil it had housed. The hunter's story had come to an end, but the experience had left us scarred forever. We knew that this victory was fragile, and that evil could find another way to manifest itself. But for now, we had managed to banish the darkness. We returned to our lives, wiser and more vigilant, ready to face any challenge that came our way. The hunter's house was now just a dark memory, a warning that true terror might be lurking, waiting for the right moment to resurface. In the days after our escape from the hunter's house, I tried to return to normality. Anna and John were doing the same, but it was clear that we all carried the scars of that macabre encounter. The shadows in our minds were hard to dispel, and any strange noise or moving shadow brought back memories of the terror we had faced. One night, when we were gathered in my apartment for a quiet dinner, Anna suggested that we should revisit the place where we had buried the remains of the mirror, to make sure that the evil had truly been banished. The idea seemed absurd to me, but something in her voice suggested she was right. João, ever the pragmatic one, agreed, arguing that we needed some real closure to what had happened. The next day, we set off early for the forest, carrying only flashlights and a map that Anna had drawn. The sun was setting when we arrived at the site, and the forest was plunged into an eerie silence. The trail we were following seemed darker and more oppressive than before, and a sense of foreboding settled in the air. As we reached the burial site, we realized something was wrong. The ground, which should have been disturbed only by our previous digging, now seemed to have been disturbed again. It was as if someone or something had tried to unearth the remains of the mirror. We looked at each other, fear in everyone's eyes. "I think we should go back," I whispered, my voice betraying my nervousness. But before we could decide, a cold breeze blew through the forest and the trees began to creak as if something were moving among them. Suddenly, the light from the lanterns flickered and went out. We stood in the darkness, our eyes wide open, trying to see anything. "Is anyone here?" Anna called, her voice shaking. A violin began to echo through the forest, the same melody we had heard in the hunter's house. My heart raced, and a chill ran down my spine. The music was melancholy, full of pain and despair. The shadows around us began to writhe, and we realized we were not alone. Suddenly, we saw the pale figure of the hunter emerge from the shadows, more hideous and powerful than before. His presence was overwhelming, and the air around us seemed to freeze. "Do you think you can get rid of me?" His voice echoed, cold and evil. "I am eternal. I am the darkness you can never banish." He advanced slowly, and the forest seemed to respond to his command. The trees bent toward us, and the violin music grew louder. We knew that running would be futile. We had to face him one last time. I remembered the words from the diary, and the power of the amulet that had destroyed the mirror. I took the amulet from my pocket and held it up, trying to summon the same force that had saved us before. But the hunter laughed, a horrible sound that reverberated through the forest. "Your amulet has no power here. You are on my land now." Anna and John moved closer, forming a circle around me. Together we began to recite the banishments from the diary, trying to use our collective strength against evil. The hunter advanced, and the light from the amulet began to glow faintly. The pale figure screamed, a sound that was a mix of rage and agony, but it kept moving forward. The shadows around us became tangible, like dark tentacles trying to grab us. We felt the pressure building, and the air became almost unbreathable. The amulet's light wavered, and we knew we needed something stronger. "We cannot give up," I shouted, my voice echoing in the forest. "Together, we are stronger than him." Our desperation turned to determination. We continued chanting, our voices joining in a cry of resistance. The amulet's light grew brighter and more intense. The hunter began to retreat, his form fading into the light. With a final effort, we raised the amulet and directed all our energy toward it. The light exploded in a blinding flash, and the hunter's scream echoed through the forest as his figure disintegrated into a cloud of shadows. The trees stopped moving, and the violin fell silent. As the light faded, we realized the hunter had disappeared. The forest was silent, and the sense of oppression had vanished. We knew we had finally banished the evil, but the cost had been high. We returned to the city, exhausted and wounded, but relieved. We knew the battle was over, but the scars would remain forever. The hunter's home was finally at peace, but the memories of the terror we had faced would never be forgotten. As we looked out over the forest one last time, we knew that although we had won the battle, the war against the darkness was eternal. We were prepared for any challenge that came our way, with the courage and determination to never give up, even in the darkest of nights. On nights on the road where the wind blows tales of despair and the stars seem to watch silently, danger can lurk in the shadows, ready to emerge when you least expect it. My name is Lucas, and this is the story of how a shortcut turned into the worst nightmare of my life. I've always liked adventures, and driving at night was one of my favorites. That particular night, my friends, Pedro, Mariana, and Julia and I, decided to hit the road for an impromptu road trip. Our destination was the neighboring city, but a series of unforeseen events delayed us, and night fell quickly. Pedro, the most adventurous of the group, suggested that we take a shortcut along a deserted road. "Let's save time and still enjoy the adrenaline," he said, with that smile that only he could make seem reassuring. We agree, more out of lack of an alternative than out of enthusiasm. The road was winding, surrounded by trees that closed in on us like a tunnel. The sound of crickets and the occasional howl of a distant animal were our only companions. The light from the headlights seemed to be devoured by the darkness around us. I drove, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that was growing in my chest. Suddenly, we saw a man on the side of the road waving desperately. He looked like he needed help. Mariana, always the most empathetic, suggested that we stop. I hesitated, but ended up agreeing. As we approached, I saw that he was a thin man, with worn-out clothes and a desperate look in his eyes. "Please, can you give me a lift?" he asked, voice shaking. "My car broke down further ahead and I need help." I looked at my friends, and they all nodded. We opened the door and he entered. "My name is Carlos," he said, with a smile that seemed forced. "Thank you for stopping." As we continued along the road, Carlos started telling stories about disappearances in the region. He talked about people who took that same road and were never seen again. His eyes glowed with a disturbing intensity as he described macabre details. Pedro tried to divert the topic, but Carlos seemed fixated on his stories. That's when things started to get really weird. The car radio turned on by itself, playing a strange, distorted melody. The dashboard lights blinked, and an intense cold took over the car, despite the heat of the night. I looked at my friends, all of whom had expressions of growing fear. Suddenly, Carlos began speaking in a lower tone, almost like a whisper. "They're here," he said, looking out the window. "The spirits of those who disappeared." Mariana tried to laugh nervously. "You're trying to scare us, right?" Carlos just looked at her seriously. "This is not a joke. Do you think you are alone here?" Fear settled deep within us. The road seemed to go on forever, and there was no sign of life around us. I began to feel like we were being watched, but there was nothing visible in the dark other than the road. Pedro, always the most rational, suggested that we stop to check the map. I parked the car on the side of the road and we all got out to stretch our legs. The silence was oppressive. Suddenly, we heard a noise coming from the forest next to the road. It was a low sound, like something dragging. Carlos remained motionless, observing the forest with a fixed gaze. "Don't get out of the car," he whispered. "They can feel our fear." Ignoring the warning, Pedro and I grabbed flashlights and decided to investigate. Every step we took seemed to take us deeper into a nightmare. The trees around us seemed to close in, and the air was filled with a sense of imminent danger. We saw shadows moving through the trees, and the whispers began to become clearer, as if something or someone was communicating with us. Suddenly, Pedro's flashlight went out, leaving us in total darkness. I heard the sound of heavy breathing behind me, and as I turned, I saw a tall, indistinct shadow approaching. I yelled for Pedro to run, and we started back to the car, the whispers now turning into distorted screams. When we got to the car, Carlos was outside, staring into the forest. "You shouldn't have left," he said, his voice full of despair. "Now they know where we are." We got in the car quickly and I started the engine. As we drove, the sounds around us increased, as if we were being followed by an invisible horde. Panic took over me, but I tried to remain calm. The screams, the whispers, everything seemed to merge into a terrifying cacophony. Carlos began to laugh, a low, disturbing laugh. "Do you really think you can escape?" he asked. Turning to us, his eyes glowed with an insane light. "They won't let you go." That's when I realized it wasn't just the road that was holding us back. Carlos was part of it, a link between us and the terror that surrounded us. I tried to ignore his words, focusing on the road, but the feeling of despair was overwhelming. Suddenly the car stopped. The engine died and nothing I did could restart it. We got out of the car, desperate, trying to find a way out. The forest around us felt alive, the trees moving as if they wanted to swallow us. Carlos got out of the car too, now with an expression of triumph on his face. "Welcome to the end of the road," he said, his voice echoing in the darkness. "Now, you are theirs." The screams around us increased, and shadows began to emerge from the trees, indistinct but clearly threatening shapes. I took Mariana's hand, trying to protect her, but I knew we were surrounded. Carlos disappeared into the darkness, his laugh still echoing in our ears. Pedro tried to start the car again, but it was useless. The screams were getting closer, and we could feel the presence of shadows around us. It was then that I saw, in the distance, a beam of light, a minimal but real hope. "Let's go to the light," I shouted, and we started running towards it. Every step was a challenge, as if the earth itself was trying to stop us. Mariana stumbled, but I helped her up. Pedro and Julia were close behind, all running towards that small hope of salvation. The shadows chased us, their screams filling the air. When we finally reached the light, we saw that it was a small cabin, apparently abandoned. We entered, locking the door behind us. The cabin was dusty and old, but it offered a modicum of security. We stood there, trying to catch our breath, as the sounds outside slowly died down. "What was this?" Mariana asked, still shaking with fear. I had no answer. I only knew that the terror we faced was real, and that we were not safe yet. Suddenly, the door opened with a bang. Carlos was there, his eyes now completely black. "Do you think you can hide?" he whispered, stepping into the cabin. Panic took over us again. I picked up a piece of wood to defend myself, but I knew it would be useless. Shadows began to enter the cabin, and the cold intensified. It was then that, in a last act of desperation, Pedro found a can of gasoline and threw it around the cabin. "Get out now!" he screamed. We all ran outside, and he lit a match and threw it inside. The cabin burst into flames, and we heard inhuman screams coming from inside. The firelight chased away the shadows, and for a moment, we felt we were saved. But Carlos's laughter still echoed in the night, reminding us that the terror was far from over. We ran down the road without looking back. Finally, we spotted a police car patrolling the area. We screamed for help, and the police took us to a safe place. We told our story, but we knew it would be difficult for them to fully believe it. Today, as I write these words, I still feel the weight of that night. The shadows may have receded, but the fear never completely disappears. Carlos, or whatever he was, left an indelible mark on our lives. I know that terror can return at any moment, always lurking, waiting to envelop us in its cold, deadly embrace again. And so, my story continues, marked by fear and constant vigilance. I know that true tranquility is still out of reach, and the battle for our mental peace is constant. I hope that one day, finally, we can find true tranquility, away from the shadows that still surround us. The darkness may recede, but it never completely disappears, always ready to strike again. That night seemed to have no end. After the police dropped us off at a motel, we tried to calm down and understand what had really happened. The shadows, Carlos, the burning cabin. Everything seemed like something out of a nightmare. But the mark this experience left on us was deep and real. I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Sitting on the bed, I looked out the window and saw the reflection of the headlights of a car passing along the road. My thoughts went back to that night, to the moment we first saw Carlos. How had he become that monster? Pedro was on the other side of the room, trying to sleep, but his eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling. Mariana and Julia were in the next room. Fear was palpable in the air. With every minute, the tension increased, as if we were expecting something terrible to happen at any moment. Shortly after 3 in the morning, a metallic clang echoed through the hallway. I got up quickly, with my heart racing, and went to the door. Pedro got up too, taking a chair to defend himself. I opened the door slowly and looked into the empty hallway. The silence was oppressive. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Pedro. He nodded, gripping the chair tighter. It was then that we heard a whisper, coming from the end of the corridor. A low whisper, barely audible, but clearly human. The voice was familiar. "You cannot escape," said the whisper repeatedly. Pedro and I looked at each other, terror evident in our eyes. Suddenly, the light in the hallway began to flicker. The shadows on the walls danced eerily. We decided to go to Mariana and Julia's room. I knocked on the door, trying not to make any noise. Julia opened it with an expression of terror. "What is happening?" she asked, voice shaking. "We don't know, but we need to get out of here," said Pedro, trying to remain calm. We quickly gathered our things and left the room. The whispering continued, louder and louder, closer and closer. The corridor seemed to lengthen as we walked, and the cold increased. Mariana held my hand, and I felt the tremor at her touch. We arrived at the motel lobby and found the attendant, who seemed oblivious to what was happening. "Did you hear those noises?" I asked, but he just looked at us indifferently. "I didn't hear anything," he replied, in a monotonous voice. The whisper was now a scream, a horrible, distorted sound that echoed throughout the motel. We went out to the parking lot trying to find our car. The night was cold and dark, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. We finally found the car and quickly got in. I tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't respond. Come on," I shouted, trying not to panic. Pedro tried to help, but the engine was dead. Suddenly, the scream stopped, and a deadly silence took over the environment. I looked around, trying to understand what was happening. That's when I saw a figure in the distance, slowly walking towards us. It was Carlos, with an evil smile on his face. "Do you think you can escape?" he asked, his voice cold as the wind. "You are mine now." Panic took over us. Pedro got out of the car, trying to confront Carlos, but something in the air changed. The atmosphere became heavy, and the air felt difficult to breathe. Carlos raised his hand, and Pedro was thrown against the car with an invisible force. Mariana and Julia started to scream, and I felt my despair increase. I took the flashlight and pointed it at Carlos, but the light seemed to be absorbed by him, making him even more sinister. "Run!" I shouted, and we all got out of the car, running down the road. Carlos followed us, his laughter echoing in the night. Each step felt heavier, and the feeling that something was wrong grew. We saw an abandoned house on the side of the road and decided to hide there, hoping that Carlos wouldn't find us. The house was in ruins, with broken windows and doors falling to pieces. We went in and found a corner to hide, trying to control our breathing. The silence was absolute, but we knew he was close. Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside. I looked through the window and saw Carlos standing at the entrance of the house. His eyes glowed in the darkness, and he began reciting something in a language I didn't understand. The cold increased, and the shadows around us began to move. Mariana held my hand tighter, and Pedro found a piece of wood to defend himself. Julia was silent, her eyes wide with fear. Carlos entered the house, the atmosphere becoming even more oppressive. It was then that I felt a presence beside me. I turned and saw a shadowy figure, a woman in an old, torn dress. Her eyes were pools of darkness, and she whispered something I couldn't understand. Her presence was cold and terrifying. Carlos advanced toward us, and the shadowy figure began to move as well. Panic took over me, and I knew we needed to do something. I picked up the flashlight again and shone it at the shadowy figure, hoping the light would drive it away. Surprisingly, she retreated, disappearing into the darkness. Carlos stopped, his expression changing to anger. "You can't defeat me," he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. It was then that I realized that the only way to face him was to face what was hidden in that house. Something was keeping Carlos and the shadows there, something we needed to find out. I began exploring the house, looking for any clue that could help us. Pedro, Mariana, and Julia followed me, all trying to understand what to do. We found an old basement with stairs that went down into the darkness. We knew the answer was down there. We descended, each step increasing the feeling of oppression. In the basement, we find an old chest. When we opened it, we saw an old violin, covered in dust. There was also a diary, with pages yellowed with age. I took the diary and started reading. The words described ancient rituals and the invocation of spirits to protect the house. But something went wrong, and the spirits were trapped, cursing anyone who tried to interfere. Carlos appeared at the basement entrance, his presence even more sinister. "You found what you shouldn't have," he said, moving forward. I picked up the violin and, without thinking, started playing a melody that was in the diary. The music echoed through the basement, and I felt a change in the air. The shadows began to retreat, and Carlos screamed in anger. I continued playing, each note seeming to release the trapped spirits. The cold subsided, and light began to penetrate the darkness. Carlos fell to the ground, screaming in pain. "You can't do this," he shouted, but he knew we were on the right path. I continued playing until finally, with one last scream, Carlos disappeared, and the basement fell silent. We walked up the stairs, the morning light starting to filter into the house. We knew the nightmare was over, but the experience left us with deep scars. We went back to the car, which miraculously worked, and we left, leaving the house and the terror behind. Today, as I write these words, I know that we face something far beyond what we could imagine. The darkness may have receded, but the memory of that night will never completely disappear. I know we need to be vigilant, for terror can return at any moment, always lurking, ready to envelop us in its cold, deadly embrace once again. And so, my story continues, marked by fear and constant vigilance. I know that true tranquility is still out of reach, and the battle for our mental peace is constant. I hope that one day, finally, we can find true tranquility, away from the shadows that still surround us. The darkness may recede, but it never completely disappears, always ready to strike again. That morning seemed to bring temporary relief, but the marks of what we had experienced were deeply engraved in our minds. On the way back to town, we remained silent, trying to process what had happened. The experience in the abandoned house, the shadows, Carlos, and the rituals. Everything seemed like a nightmare that we couldn't leave behind. We decided that we needed to tell the police everything again and seek professional help to deal with the trauma. When we finally arrived at the police station, we were greeted with looks of concern. The police officer who attended to us, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, listened to our story attentively. "You did the right thing by coming here," one he said, after hearing our report. "We will send a team to investigate the house, and I will ensure that everyone receives psychological support." We left the police station a little more relieved, but still feeling the weight of terror. The officer assured us that the investigation would begin immediately, and that we would be informed of any developments. We returned to our homes, trying to find some semblance of normality. That night I decided to stay awake. Sleep seemed impossible, and the feeling of being watched persisted. As I looked out the window, I saw the street lights flicker and the figure of a man standing in the distance. My eyes widened when I recognized the silhouette. It was Carlos or something that looked like him. It can't be, I whispered to myself, backing away slowly. I picked up my phone and called Pedro. Pedro, he's here, he said, trying to control the panic in my voice. Pedro arrived quickly, and together we watched Carlos's figure slowly approaching. His presence was more sinister than ever. "We have to get out of here," said Pedro, his voice firm, but his eyes showing fear. We ran out of the house, but Carlos disappeared before we could get to the street. Absolute terror gripped us when we realized he was not alone. Other shadowy figures began to emerge, stepping out of the shadows, their eyes glowing with indescribable evil. We ran down the street, trying to catch up to the car. The feeling of cold was crushing, and each step felt heavier. When we finally reached the car, we saw Mariana and Julia running towards us, panic evident on their faces. "He's everywhere," shouted Julia, and we knew we needed to get away. We got in the car and started driving, aimlessly, just trying to escape the shadows that were chasing us. The road was deserted, and the silence was disturbing. Suddenly, the car's lights began to fail, and the engine began to choke. "This isn't happening," said Pedro, trying to maintain control of the car. It was then that we saw a figure on the road in front of us. Carlos was standing in the middle of the road, his eyes fixed on us. The car stopped abruptly, and the engine stalled. The darkness around us seemed to take on a life of its own, and shadows began to surround us. "We have to get out of here," I screamed, but I knew there was nowhere to run. Carlos approached slowly, an evil smile on his face. "Do you think you can escape? The darkness is in you now," he said, his voice echoing like thunder. Absolute terror gripped me. I knew there was no escape this time. The shadows approached, and I felt the intense cold envelop my body. Pedro, Mariana, and Julia were paralyzed with fear, and I knew our chances were slim. It was then that I remembered the diary we found in the abandoned house. There was something about a melody that could drive away the spirits, a last hope. I grabbed my phone and looked for the recording I had made of the melody. With shaking hands, I pressed play, and the song started playing. The shadows hesitated, and Carlos screamed in rage. "You can't do that," he shouted, but he knew it was our only chance. I continued playing the song, each note seeming to cut through the darkness around us. Carlos began to writhe in pain, and the shadows began to retreat. The heavy atmosphere began to dissipate, and light began to penetrate the darkness. Carlos let out one last agonizing scream before disappearing completely, and the shadows followed the same fate. The silence that followed was deafening, but finally the terror seemed to be over. We looked at each other, breathless and relieved, but we knew that what we experienced would mark us forever. The road was deserted again, and the car miraculously started. We returned to the city, knowing that we would need a lot of time to process everything that had happened. As I write these words, I know that we face something far beyond what we could imagine. The darkness may have receded, but the memory of that night will never completely disappear. I know we need to be vigilant, for terror can return at any moment, always lurking, ready to envelop us in its cold, deadly embrace once again. And so, my story continues, marked by fear and constant vigilance. I know that true tranquility is still out of reach, and the battle for our mental peace is constant. I hope that one day, finally, we can find true tranquility, away from the shadows that still surround us. The darkness may recede, but it never completely disappears, always ready to strike again.